The Automated Podcast.
So hi there, as always, this is Marc Verbenkov and welcome to another Automated Podcast episode. So this week I spoke with Brigitte Tousignant on the topic of automated journalism. So I've been meaning to have her on the podcast for a few weeks now, specifically to discuss a recent series of news events pertaining to a number of news outlets actually firing some staff and replacing them with AI systems. So though I have briefly introduced automated journalism in previous episodes, I really found Brigitte's points and analysis to be much more comprehensive. So if you're intrigued by how AI is impacting the journalism industry, I'm sure you're really going to enjoy this discussion. So Brigitte is a freelance journalist based in Montreal, Canada. Her most notable work was her involvement in Tainted H2O, which was a 2019 national collaborative investigation facilitated by the Institute for Investigative Journalism. And here it was revealed that the provinces were not accurately measuring lead levels in drinking water, which unfortunately left Canadians exposed to lead levels comparable to or even higher than those of Flint, Michigan, even at the height of their 2015 water crisis. So she is currently completing her thesis in the Digital Innovation in Journalism Master's Program at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, and her thesis focuses on automated journalism in Canada, its current impact, and the future implications for Canadian journalists. Well, hi there, Brigitte. Welcome to the Automated Podcast.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, a pleasure. So I've actually been really looking forward to this discussion for a few weeks now. I think that you're right now at the end of completing your thesis on the topic of automated journalism. And it was really just in the last couple of weeks or the last month or so that a number of stories have actually come out where journalists have been fired and actually been replaced by AI. So I think that both your thesis as well as this conversation are quite relevant to the current times.
Definitely. I think that it is an ongoing debate, even though we have seen, and I know we'll be talking about this in a little bit, but what has been going on with Microsoft and how they had fired some of their journalists to replace them with automated systems. I think that this is an ongoing debate where it's surrounding, whether can AI actually replace journalists or whether it's just simply being adopted to assist them in their reporting. So I think that that is a huge thing that we have to look at right now. And when I say we, I just mean the media industry as a whole, as they continue to adopt these technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that Microsoft was definitely the big news that came out, as I said, about a month ago. But there's also been like little articles every now and then that I've picked up about AI replacing either certain tasks or certain jobs within the media industry. So I'm really interested to learn a little bit more because my connection to the media industry clearly isn't as big as yours. But maybe we can start off by having you explain a little bit about the forms of reporting or journalism that are kind of susceptible to automation. I can imagine that many people would think that like reporting the scores of say like sports games is something that could be really easily done by AI, but I would also assume that there's significantly more to that.
Yeah, so you're right. So, the first thing to keep in mind is that automated journalism is really kind of an umbrella term, and it's taken on a wide array of meanings because it can really be applied to almost every step of the news production pipeline. So what's most susceptible to automation is really it's reporting where there is very rich and structured data, which is why in its current application or where some newsrooms are using it now, it's really for sports reporting. So sport game recaps and business, health stories, election coverage for government, even crime reporting. So anything that's very rich in or statistically rich data that can definitely be automated. And when it comes to those types of stories, you really get, it's using natural language processing to do like an automated generation of content. So that's only one form of automation. But then you also have the automation sort of on the back end where you have web scraping, which has kind of always been around, and data mining using machine learning, where you're actually using really sophisticated algorithms, or they're doing it for the journalist or the editor or whoever, to really analyze complex data and find really interesting patterns in the data that maybe the human eye couldn't see.
That's very interesting. I want to go back to the kind of first form that you were talking about. I would also assume that, say, with sports or finance or election coverage, a lot of these already have a very basic or used structure, right? So this is something that the AI can just kind of plug into a template, where humans are doing that currently today.
Yep, exactly. So you also have to think that, algorithms don't build themselves, right? So there's a human behind that. Um, at least at the very beginning of automation, there's always someone, either like an engineer or a tech team that are building these things. Exactly, like you said, I mean, if I can talk about my thesis for a bit, there was
Hmm.
a journalist who he built the template and I guess the algorithm for the automatic text generation that they were using in their newsroom for junior hockey league game recaps in Canada. And so essentially, because there's, on any given night, there could be 50 of these hockey games going on across the country. So it makes it impossible to have, a couple of journalists covering all of them. So at the end of these games, they just kind of get the statistics or the recaps of like who won, who
Hmm.
lost, who did the scores get plugged into this template. And then within about 60 seconds, these stories are generated.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that I'm still wrapping my head around, like how quickly this can be done as compared to the human counterparts that have been doing it for, well, forever.
Well, exactly. And so that's what, a lot of experts or people are saying is that the main advantage to these tools and processes is that they can produce at speed and scale. So like generating automated stories and identifying interesting patterns in complex data, it's speed that's unmatched by humans.
Hmm. And so, I mean, you said speed and the scale are two of the main, if not the reasons why AI has begun to replace these journalists, but I'm sure that there are others, right? The cost savings, I'm assuming, for
Yes,
Microsoft
yes.
was one of the main reasons that they would be letting go of the journalists that they had. Maybe you can touch on some of these other reasons as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, that is probably, besides the advantages in terms of speed and scale and expanding coverage, the most important one is that, all of these things can be achieved with very low marginal costs for
Hmm.
newsrooms. And I can attest to, the state of journalism in Europe, but in North America, at the very least, unless you're the New York Times or you're the Washington Post, which is, funded by Jeff Bezos, media organizations are in a really dire state. It's crumbling business
Hmm.
models, and
Hmm.
there's a lack of money and resources, and so there's also a lot of job cuts. And this is regardless of automation. And so, because of these advantages and these cost-saving abilities of these newsroom algorithms and AI systems, that's why we're seeing a growth in this sector.
Right, right. And so do you think that this is potentially a technology that will save a lot of these larger organizations? Well, I'll start with that and then I'll ask another question after.
Sure. Well, that goes back to the really interesting debate about whether or not it can replace journalists.
Hmm.
Because something to consider is that yes, these things can happen with at a very low cost for newsrooms, but at the same time, it costs money to hire a dedicated team of engineers and tech people to come in and actually build these systems. Or if you don't want to have these things developed in house, you need to outsource. And so
Hmm.
that all costs money. So, I don't think that this is going to fully be integrated everywhere because, if journalism is still in a dire state, they kind of need to figure out first how to make money. It's kind of, you don't want to put the cart before the horse kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, that's perfect. That's a good segue into the other question I wanted to ask. Um, one of the things with a lot of the kind of emerging technologies, apart from AI, is that it enables smaller companies to actually become competitive with the larger kind of stabilized organizations. But I think you touched on it already. If you have to hire an entire team of engineers in order to build an AI, maybe smaller news stations might not have the resources to actually use these AI journalists or these automated journalists in order to become competitive, to have the same kind of speed or accuracy or cost savings that the larger ones would.
Exactly. And I mean, what I've seen through my research is that in Canada, the newsrooms that are using these, artificial intelligence enhanced systems, are the larger ones.
Mm-hmm.
The smaller ones are still, we say that in Canada, the local journalism or community journalism, it's Canada's news deserts. So they're struggling, and I don't think for them right now anyways that we'll see these tools coming in. However, like in the long run, if ever they are able to adopt these technologies or at least integrate them, I don't think it would necessarily replace their journalists, but maybe it would actually allow them to produce more, to maybe expand their local coverage.
Right. And I think this touches on a bit of a larger issue that we've talked about before recording the podcast, was that the actual use of AI journalism actually enables journalists to do maybe more creative type work rather than doing the repetitive or rote type of actions, whether it's data gathering or otherwise, that might be a little bit boring for journalists to do, honestly.
Exactly. And so if you let me actually go back to what we were saying earlier about, or use Microsoft as an example. So when Microsoft announced in May that it was going to replace, I think it was a little bit over 70 of their part-time media contractors with these AI systems for their MSN news and research website, it's important to mention that what these former employees did wasn't actually writing journalism stories. So even though they're considered journalists or media professionals, what they were doing was selecting and curating trending news stories from various news outlets and then performing content optimization. So that's essentially, it's replacing keywords or modifying headlines or changing the pictures so that these stories become more appealing to their audience, which drives clicks, gains more views. So it's important to mention that while they were doing these tasks, which we can consider to be, or not that we can consider to be, but they are considered to be these repetitive and routine tasks that AI can replace. So when they were doing these tasks, they were actually already semi-automated because they were being helped by algorithms. So there was already a type of human-machine relationship there. But now in removing the humans from the process, Microsoft gave the complete authority and editorial oversight to the AI. So completely removing humans from the picture and thus human input.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and also maybe a little bit scary for some people to hear that the entire decision-making process was given to the AI. Maybe that's a good segue into the problems of using AI journalists. We talked beforehand about the fact that these AI journalists made the mistake of misidentifying the Little Mix British pop group.
Yeah, definitely. So, these AI journalists have been operating for a little over a month, and it's already made a huge mistake. And I think that it's been amplified because we're currently going through the Black Lives Matter movement.
Exactly.
So the story was done about a singer of Little Mix and her experience with racism and her ongoing advocacy. So instead of using a picture of that singer who is mixed race, the AI selected a picture of her bandmate, who also happens to be mixed race but is darker skinned. So essentially, the AI algorithm associated a story about racism to Blackness and then selected a picture of the band member who had the darkest skin, even though the story wasn't about her at all. And so after this happened and after it received major backlash, Microsoft released a statement saying that this error was not a result of algorithmic bias, but an experimental feature in the automated system. And now what I think it's important to mention is that this algorithmic bias that they're talking about is the fact that, these systems are built with inherent biases, right? And these algorithms are applied to all types of industries, as you've covered in, your other podcasts. But essentially, if I can give you a specific example about this inherent bias built into algorithms and racial discrimination, is that this isn't the first time this is a problem. This has been seen with search engines, for example. So there is an author in particular from UCLA, Safia Umoja Noble, and she wrote a book about it called Algorithms of Oppression and How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. So in her book, she provides examples of algorithmically driven data failures that are specific to people of color and women, which emphasizes the fundamental ways that racism and sexism are embedded into algorithms. So if you go back to 2009, for example, if you would search Michelle Obama in Google search engine, one of the top hits was a picture of her that was completely racist and just so wrong, and her face was replaced with that of an ape. And Google let that become the top picture. So there is like a huge problem with algorithms.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There have been only a few of these more specific issues with the kind of inherent programming of AI, or even some of the technologies that come out of specifically Silicon Valley. One of the earlier stories that I heard about, maybe you have as well, where you have these automated water dispensers in bathrooms, and there was a company that was installing them, and white people would have their hands recognized and have the water dispensed, whereas a black colleague, for instance, would not. So the recognition system would not recognize darker colored skin. So I think that this is a problem not just with AI journalism or Google search results, but it's kind of embedded in a lot of the technologies that are coming out now. Which is, of course, a problem, but I think that the riots, specifically in the States, have really shone a light on this. Have you, in your research, seen any kind of action towards dealing with this in the tech space?
So this is something that there's a growing body of research looking into, how do we hold these algorithms accountable? And right now it's really not well defined. It's a very the lines are blurred because, for example, Microsoft made this costly error. They fixed it, but then who is to be held accountable? It can't just be the AI. So is it Microsoft? But then it can't just be Microsoft as a whole because they'll just brush that off. So is it then their team, the team behind whoever built it, their engineers or their tech teams? So it's really, it's tough to say, but then when these engineers that build Microsoft's AI system, they're not considered journalists. So for journalism specifically, it becomes problematic because, for a regular journalism story, if a newsroom makes an error, they'll fix it. And because of, the journalistic code of ethics, they'll usually release a statement or a blurb with the edited story and apologize for the error to hold themselves to account. So with AI, these lines kind of become blurred. Like, how do we hold them accountable for their actions? And that's something that's being studied right now. And again, it's not really well defined.
Yeah. And I think one of the main problems is that this is such a new phenomenon. What you're describing is very similar, if not almost identical, to the kind of ethical issues or maybe even accountability issues with regards to autonomous vehicles, right? If somebody is speeding, is it the person? Is it the autonomous vehicle? Is it the automaker, or is it the engineers of the actual software? So these issues, I think, have a lot of different connections to the different industries that they're being applied to. I think it's very interesting, and maybe I'll have to have you back on the podcast in a year or so after some sort of maybe ethical guidelines have been, or accountability guidelines have been created for the journalism sector, anyways.
And that's the problem too, right? Is that it probably won't be established for a while because this isn't widespread yet. The people that are using these systems, like the Washington Post or the Globe and Mail in Canada, or Microsoft, which I guess is more global, they're big and they have money. And right now, journalists or journalism, the industry doesn't have the funds to bring this in. So although it is happening, it's kind of happening with no rules. It's going to be a while before this sector really, really grows to incorporate or to see AI kind of more widespread, which means that unfortunately, it's kind of going to be lawless for a while.
Yeah. Well, maybe a little bit of a biased perspective. I also think that why conversations like this are so important, because it makes people aware that maybe their news has a little bit more bias or does have accountability issues if they hear a conversation like this.
Definitely. And so I just wanted to mention that one thing that is being established a little bit more is the importance of adding a methodology or a byline saying that, this story was generated by XAI or whatever automated system. And if you are using, AI or really sophisticated algorithms to go through a lot of structure or complex data,
Mm-hmm.
nowadays, I think newsrooms are making more of an effort to share the methodology or to publish the methodology to make sure that this is replicable, this is legitimate. So, there are steps towards making this a little bit more ethical.
Right, right. Okay, maybe we can move on from here. There was one thing that we had discussed previously, which ties into kind of the future of AI journalism or automated journalism. And this is a term that you used with a civic prosthetic, right? And this is where AI journalism is there to assist human reporters. We talked a little bit about how these automated journalists are replacing humans, but maybe you can touch a little bit on the assisting or the augmenting nature of these AI systems.
Sure. So, a lot of the research contends that AI algorithms, newsbots, whichever form of automated journalism you're using, will become complementary to human reporters. And like you said, this has been called civic prosthetic, or just an enhanced relationship between human and machines, where these expert systems will just assist human reporters rather than replace them. And so the main argument here is that automation can never replace critical thinking, ethical judgment, and creativity, and capturing nuances, and also more importantly, human to human interaction, right? Because a
Yeah.
lot of stories, there needs to be a human element to it. You have to go and interview sources. You have to establish sources. These are all things that AI will never be able to do, or not anytime soon anyways, probably
Yeah.
not, I don't even think in our lifetime.
I just wanted to clarify: is this your personal belief, or is this something that you've read in the research that you've done for your thesis, that these critical thinking skills or ethical judgment or creativity, etc., will never be able to be done as it pertains to media?
So it's actually both.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the news professionals that I spoke to during my research, they all contend that there's no way that AI will be able to fully replace humans. And that in any case, even if they encroach more of the news production pipeline, there will always be a need for humans involved. Editorial oversight is so important, and I think we're seeing that the consequences of not having any with Microsoft, it leads to really costly errors. So I don't think that it's going to happen anytime soon, and researchers agree.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think this is also maybe a bit more of a kind of a popular discussion, right? Whether humans will be fully phased out or fully replaced, versus, as you're discussing this civic prosthetic idea, where they will be assisted and actually have their work improved with the hybridization between the journalists and the AIs.
Exactly. But I do think that people or journalists right now remain cautious and skeptical. And I think that they're justifiably so, because, if we look back to the automobile industry, when they started developing automated robots to kind of come into these factories, they said that it was to assist the workers, but in the end they ended up replacing those workers. And
Mm-hmm.
the automobile manufacturing industry it completely went automated, and a lot of people lost their jobs. If you look at what happened in Detroit, it was kind of catastrophic. And
Yeah.
so there is caution and skepticism, and I think that that's important. But the fact that we're having these conversations now, especially for, I can't attest to other industries, but for journalism, will hopefully help us kind of lay out the groundwork to protect our media professionals, and increase this hybridization between automated processes and humans.
Yeah, I couldn't agree further with you. I think it's a really interesting problem that's coming up. I also think that with the manufacturing idea that you are putting forward, there's a real problem with equating these different types of sectors, where we have a physical activity versus a cognitive activity. And one of the key things there is that this is a physical activity that's been replaced, whereas AI or automation systems will never be able to take care of these critical thinking or the creative activities that we do, where journalism, I think, has been included in that bundle of the cognitive activities. And it's interesting that it's really only been in the last couple of years, correct me if I'm wrong, that AI-enabled processes have really been intruding on these creative or critical thinking activities.
I definitely agree with you, but what's so interesting is that this whole argument, namely, can computers demonstrate cognitive intelligence equal to or surpassing a human's capacity? These questions, or this debate, has been around since 1950, with Alan Turing actually being the first one to ask this question. And so we're still debating the exact same thing that he put out 70 plus years ago. So it's like you said, where now, we used to only look at AI and how it could really encroach the physical labor sector. Now that we're really focusing on cognitive sectors like journalism, like the arts, and any other type of work that really needs or requires more cognitive intelligence, it's really interesting that this is only really being addressed now in journalism, and how there is a risk, but also at the same time, it can be mitigated. There are ways to make sure that people don't lose their jobs, and that this is more of a positive relationship that can be established between automated systems and newsrooms.
Yeah, I think the conversation always goes more or less, will jobs be erased, or maybe what new jobs will come from this new technology that's being implemented. Maybe we can touch on that a little bit. One of the things that has come up is new forms of journalism that are slowly gaining traction. This is one of the things that you wrote to me before, was something called a watchdog role. Maybe you can touch on that a little bit and explain that, because I think that's quite an interesting idea.
Sure. So I just want to make it clear, though, that this watchdog role has always been part of journalism's ethical backbone, where journalists or newsrooms in general have always strived to hold higher powers or people in power to account. And so in fulfilling this watchdog role, they're always doing it in serving the public interest. So what's come from all these algorithms and AI is what's known as algorithmic accountability reporting. And it's this new form of journalism, like you mentioned. It's slowly getting traction because it essentially consists of journalists who are attempting to exercise this watchdog role that we just discussed about by holding algorithms and the institutions rolling them out accountable. So when I say the institutions rolling them out, this could be the government, who, I know in the US uses algorithms for policing, for social housing, insurance. And so it's mainly holding the people that are rolling out these algorithms into account, and not just the algorithms per se. Like, how are they being implemented? What types of bias are in these algorithms? The only thing is that algorithmic accountability reporting doesn't take into account, newsroom algorithms, because it'd be a little bit, it doesn't really work where you can be an algorithmic accountability reporter looking into your own newsroom's algorithms, right?
Yeah.
So there aren't clearly defined ways into holding these algorithms and newsrooms into account, but it is a good step forward just for society in general to start looking at these algorithms, to start trying to figure out, because like we were saying earlier, there's inherent bias, there's algorithms of oppression that, amplify racial discrimination. And these are all things that we've only started to look at now. And so how can we make sure that they don't cause irreparable damage in society?
This new form of journalism, this algorithmic accountability reporting, have you in your research come across any use of algorithms to do that? Or is this strictly kind of more of a human form of journalism that is gaining traction or gaining more people to do that work?
Okay, so one example of algorithmic accountability reporting, even though this one is small, it's still a great example. So one journalist I had spoken to over the course of my research told me that he was using a Twitter bot to monitor every time a federal candidate retweeted during the 2019 federal election. And so just to specify, this is in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wanted to see if these candidates were retweeting fake news or falling for misinformation. So he had a Twitter bot monitor thousands of Twitter accounts every single day to see, how much or how many times were candidates falling for misinformation or propagating fake news onto their followers. And so by doing this, he was able to run it through a service that checks if the account being retweeted is a bot or bot-like. And then he would have a filter that would kind of flag suspicious retweets. And so he used that for a story to show how one federal candidate in particular was really spreading misinformation, whether they knew it or not.
That's really interesting. I think that this is also leading to potentially more ethical politics, if that's even possible. You can help. I mean, maybe Trump is throwing that narrative out the window, but maybe in other countries, this is something that could be done. I think that's a very interesting idea.
Definitely.
Okay, well, those were some of the main questions I wanted to ask you. I think that the last thing that I could really pose to you is, what is the future or the ultimate future of journalism as it pertains to these automated journalists?
Well, I can only speak of my own personal opinion, because
yes, please.
like we've said or discussed throughout this entire discussion, is that it's still so new to journalism, and there's no policies yet that are clearly established or well defined to really rein it in. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, does it need to be reined in yet? Because it's really not applied to that many newsrooms. So as we've seen with Microsoft, and we could almost argue that this was a blessing for journalism in general, because we're able to see the types of costly mistakes that AI systems can make. And it's not the first one, but since Microsoft is such a huge tech company, it makes journalists or newsrooms look back and say, whoa, we need to have ethical guidelines, and we need to keep humans and have this editorial oversight at all times. Like, we don't want this to happen to us. So I think that the future of news work is really going to be this idea of a civic prosthetic, where algorithms and AI and whichever systems you're using, they're just going to enhance reporting and not actually replace jobs.
Terrific. Yeah, this is one of the many sectors where I think this idea of augmenting the human employee will be absolutely critical going forward. Brigitte, can't thank you enough for coming on. I think some of these ideas that you've posed are absolutely fascinating, and again, very timely as it pertains to the news cycle. How can people get a hold of you if they want to get in touch with you? I know that you're on Twitter, but do you have any other places that people can reach out to you?
Definitely. I'll send you my LinkedIn and my personal email. Sorry, not personal email address. I'll send you an email address if ever anybody wants to continue the discussion with me, for sure. But thank you so much for having me. It was a great talk, and I look forward to seeing more of your work.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much for coming on, and good luck with the end of your thesis.
Thank you very much.
So thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you want to support the podcast, you can leave a like or a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to get in touch, feel free to do so over Twitter or LinkedIn by searching for Automated Podcast. On the website, automatedpodcast.org, you can leave a comment on any of the episodes, read the transcripts, and look at the sources I use in all of these episodes. There are also blog articles and additional resources and information on this topic, and podcast if you are looking for more. See you next week.
The Automated Podcast.